So I'm going to be talking to you about my 21-day solo bikepacking trip in the Highlands of Scotland, and why on earth I would do such a thing. So to start with, I'll introduce you to my setup. So this is my gorgeous adventure bike. She's called Roxanne. She's got a 12-litre seat pack on the back there, which has my tent and stove and a change of clothes in. On the front, she's got a 10-litre dry bag, which had my sleeping bag, my roll mat, food. There's a jacket and some shoes kind of bungeed onto the front there. The saddlebag is my toiletry kit, my first aid kit, and also my bike first aid kit for repairs as we went along. And all the water I was carrying with me, you can see there on the bike. So I was stopping at cafes or rivers and purifying as I went along in order to keep hydrated. It's quite an adventure. And that was me for 3 weeks. That's what I had. So who am I? I'm Jessie. And actually in the context of this talk, it feels more relevant to say who I'm not. So I am not a pro cyclist. So this trip was the first time that I'd ever cycled in cleats. In fact, I taught myself a couple of days before and then jumped on a bike and rode in them. And on this day, I don't think you can see the bruises coming through yet, but this was my second day of the tour, and my first clipped-in fall had occurred only shortly before this, where I had stopped and forgotten that I was clipped in and just not put my feet down. So not a pro cyclist. I didn't really grow up adventuring. Like, adventure and camping was something that I've only got into in my adult life. I'm not very fast, plod along at my own pace, that's sort of my thing. And actually on this trip, all of the kit that I had with me was either borrowed off friends or I'd sourced from Decathlon or Amazon. So possibly not your conventional person who you'd expect to go off doing something like this. But who I am, I'm someone who loves to learn. I love to learn about new places, and I love to learn about new people. And I'm also honestly just very bad at giving up on things, which is important to this trip. Once I've got an idea in my head, I struggle to sort of let go of it. And that often in life is not a good thing. But when it comes to adventure, and especially this adventure, it definitely was. So why did I decide to go on an almost 900-mile bike tour with almost 45,000 feet of climb, 7 ferries in it, 6 stops where I kind of shoved my bike in a bush in order to go and climb a Munro, which added another 65k or so of walking and another 550 meters climb. Oh, more than that even. I'll have to check that figure. I camped for 16 nights on this trip. And I stayed in hostels and with kind strangers for the other 4 nights. So yeah, why would I do that? Again, it might be easy to say why I didn't to start with. So it definitely wasn't for a nice holiday. I know Scotland well, and I knew what I was letting myself in for. I knew that there'd be hills and midges and rain and wind. But I also, I love Scotland. And there's just something about it that keeps me coming back. It wasn't because, as I've already said, that I find cycling super relaxing and great. It was a big, scary challenge for me. And it wasn't because I wanted a break and just wanted some time on my own. I absolutely love people, and I really do not love being on my own. So that was definitely for me the biggest challenge of this trip. So why did I go? Because I know that comfort isn't good for me, or anyone for that matter, when you have too much of it. So even looking at this photo now, it makes me feel a little bit tense inside. So I was the only person up here. I'd actually not seen anybody else all day. I'd walked for about 8 hours, hadn't seen anyone. The conditions weren't great. It was quite slippy, the terrain, so lots of scree and all the rest. And given the fact I was on a bike tour, I didn't have my trusty hardy walking boots and maybe all the other safety kit that I'd usually carry with me. So I had to make some interesting decisions about hill walking while I was up there. But also looking at this picture, I see an experience. I was experiencing that bit of Scotland as fully as I could. And even though it was tough and it was scary, I was embracing exactly where I was. And that to me is something that's really important wherever I am, and whatever's going on. I went because I owed myself some quality time. So it was a couple of weeks before I started actually what I'm doing at the moment, which is doctorate training to become a clinical psychologist. And that job, I spend a lot of time during my week thinking about other people, worrying about other people, and also trying to sort of come across as reassuring, responsible, and professional. And this was 3 weeks where the only person I had to reassure and the only person I had to look after was myself. I really like this picture, and the main reason why, I think I look quite happy. I'm in my happy place in the mountains. But also, I think this might be the only photo of me as an adult that I have where I don't have makeup on. And this trip, that meant a lot to me. It was the first time in 12 years that I'd just not bothered. I didn't even pack makeup because I had absolutely nobody to appear for or come across a certain way for. And that was really exciting, actually. I went because I love stories. But I'm not very good at reading. Don't have the attention span for it. So for me, I have to get my stories through chatting to other people, listening to stories, YesStories, often, and also living them. So this was me living a story. And I put this picture up in particular because this is one of the funniest stories that came from this trip, although incredibly frustrating at the time. I had to wait for 4 hours for the ferryman, for the Cape Wrath ferry, to sober up enough to take me across to Cape Wrath so that I could cycle out to the most northwest point of mainland Britain, because he'd been at a ceilidh the night before. What else? So that was an amusing morning, or at least it is in retrospect. I went because, as I said earlier, I love to learn. I love to learn about other cultures, other places. So these are the Callanish standing stones. And no one knows exactly what their purpose is or who put them up, but some sort of pagan monument. And yeah, I also love to learn about my own limits. And doing something like this, it lets you see yourself at your very worst and your very best. And it's quite exciting. It's quite interesting. I went because I wanted to see the start of bigger adventures. So Scotland has a place in my heart that I can't exactly explain, but whenever I go, it triggers 10 other adventures. And I realize it's a little bit ironic that I've used that wording to see the start of other adventures and then put this picture up. This was on the top of one of the Munros that I climbed. I could see absolutely nothing. But this is also the top of one of the Coolin mountains. And standing there, in that moment, I just sort of, I was up there, I'd done one. And I just realized that, at some point I'm going to have to go back and do the whole ridge line. And the Coolin Ridge, to do it, you need to be able to climb and use ropes. And so since I returned from the trip, I've signed myself up to a climbing gym and I've been learning the bits. Haven't quite got into outdoor skills yet, but thanks to lockdown, it's made that a bit tricky. But it's definitely, it's on my list. And I think that's a great thing about adventure is it breeds new adventures, even if they're quite far off sometimes. I went to reduce my carbon footprint. So I wanted to go on holiday, but I didn't want to fly. And I guess I wanted to prove to myself and maybe to other people who want to listen that you don't need to fly abroad to see beautiful things, or to learn about yourself, or to become really attached to a place and have a really magical experience somewhere. And also the brilliant thing about going somewhere a little nearer to home is that when you see those other adventures, or when you don't quite have time to do something, you can go back. It's pretty exciting. And more than anything, I went for a challenge. So this is one of the steeper hills that I did on the trip. I'm not sure the photo quite does it justice, but the fact that the road just disappears, that really was what it felt like looking back down at it. So I'd just come up this, and I was living in Oxford at the time, and before that have only lived in London. Haven't had much hill practice on the bike. But doing challenges is important. And I guess the reason why is that life isn't always easy, and it's not suddenly going to get easy in the future. And for me, I need to know that I'm okay with not easy. And I want to practice thriving when things are difficult. And so I was creating an opportunity for myself to do that. Then there were the things that I learned that I wasn't expecting. So I didn't necessarily go for these reasons, but I definitely learned some extra things on this trip. So one of the most important things I think I realized was that whenever you stop and just pay attention to this moment right now, often it turns out that things aren't so bad after all. So I'd spend quite a lot of time on my bike and my head going round and round how this trip wasn't what I'd quite expected. You know, I ended up with 9 days of torrential rain and storms. There were rivers bursting their banks. My tent was leaking. I was waking up in a puddle most mornings. It was rough. But whenever I got into camp at the end of the day and I just stopped and paid attention to the moment, I was still somewhere I wanted to be. I was still doing something I'd chosen to be. Things weren't so bad after all. And I guess what became apparent is that actually, whenever you have time to stop and notice that you're a bit sad or a bit lonely or a bit discontent, probably means things are on the way up. Because when things are really bad, you know, the really scary times on this trip, you're too busy fighting it or just trying to block it out and survive it. So that was quite a revelation for me. Another thing I learned is that connection forms through struggle. So I met a couple of cyclists on this trip who were just out being awesome, told me about how awesome they were and how great their trip was. So we'd sort of, you know, say hello and they'd go off on their awesome trip. But the cyclists who I met who stuck around for a day or two or more were the ones who, you know, we were visibly having a tough time and we wanted to share that. So this, my tent was leaking and I'd met someone lovely on one of the ferries who was also on a bike tour and struggling a bit with the weather and various other things that sort of made her plan not go as she wanted it to. So we got a bit resourceful and we decided that between us, we had enough functional kit that if we could just find a shelter for the night, then we could have a really good evening together. So we camped in this visitor centre. So it was an open visitor centre, open to the public, and it was just a sort of a hut, a roof. So with our tent inside it, you know, we had a bit of dryness. We had the tent to keep us warm, and we actually had a really lovely evening. Sort of sat out chatting, cooking together. So yeah, the connection forms through struggle and vulnerability, and that was really obvious everywhere I went. So I stopped off at cafes where people would, without saying anything, just bring me free food that I hadn't ordered and just give it to me. So it'd give me this look, and they could see me soaked through in my cycling kit that I've been wearing for 14 days straight. I made friends to ride with. I think I spent maybe 6 or 7 days riding with other people during this trip, just because you bump into people and the conditions are tough, and why would you not join with other people and share that experience? And just people who just strike up conversation and tell you that you'd inspired them or that they were going to go home and get on their bike. And I realized that I spend so much time at home in real life trying to look sorted or like I've got it all together or I know what I'm doing. But those aren't the stories people care about. That's not when people connect. And that's been quite a revelation, I think, especially during lockdown and thinking about some of the friendships that I've made over the last couple of months. I also learned that we are never in control of our environment. So this is a river bursting its banks. And there was a lot of this. But I learned that we are in control of our choices and what we decide to do within that environment. I made some bad choices on this trip, like fording this river a little bit further up and then climbing a Munro. I just shouldn't have. The weather was dreadful that day, and looking back on it, I know better. I shouldn't have been up hills. But I also made some great choices, like adding another 17 miles onto my final day to what I'd planned, when a local told me that if I were to just go a little bit further, I could go to the most northerly point of UK mainland and the most northeasterly. The most northeasterly, by the way, is not John O'Groats. Everyone thinks it is, but it's actually Duncansby Head, a little bit further, a couple of miles further along. Yeah, I felt like my legs were about to fall off, but I decided, you know what, it's the last day. And I went and I got some of the most beautiful views. I saw puffins at Dunnet Head. I walked on a beach for a short while. It was fantastic. I also learned that some of the best choices we make are the ones that we don't know we're making at the time. So because of the leaky tent situation, one night I rode out to a mountain bothy. It was about 6K off the road, not too far, I thought, but it was a gravel, really up and down track. And I ended up walking for a lot of it. It was going dark at the time, so I didn't want to risk it. There were some quite sheer drops. So I jumped off my bike and I walked it. I arrived in the dark. And when I arrived at this bothy, not only was I met by that there was someone else in there who came to the door and helped me get all my stuff in and helped me set up. And I had a really nice night sharing stories and learning about why they were there and what they were doing. But I also woke up the next day to this view. It's beautiful, I'm sure you'll agree. I also learned that I can survive loneliness, which for me in general, but especially in the context of the last few months in lockdown, it's one of the most important things I probably could have learned. I don't like being lonely, but I can survive it. And I also learned that, to be honest, if I had to be in one person's company for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 3 weeks in a row while going through some really tough stuff in rubbish conditions, dealing with a leaking tent and all the rest of it, I'd probably pick me again. I also learned that we can't appreciate safety without being unsafe sometimes. And there were some times on this trip where I was really scared, but it made me appreciate the little moments of tranquility even more, the times when I got to dry out and take care of myself. And it made me realize what a privilege it is that in my normal life, I rarely have to stop. I rarely have the opportunity to stop and appreciate that I'm physically safe. And finally, it made me realize that it doesn't matter that other people can't see my stories, that I don't come back from doing these things visibly changed, and that people will continue to take me at face value. No one can see where we've been and what we've done. Because for me, it's enough just to know that I've seen these things, I've been to these places, and I've had these experiences. And that I have a level of recognition or admiration for myself because of it. And actually, I think what I really noticed is that the people who matter in life are the ones who bother to ask about your stories. This is literally only here because in my blurb I promised otters, but it turns out that it's very hard to fit 3 weeks of touring into a short talk. But there were otters. I didn't get any photos of them, but I did see a few. But really, to finish off, I just want to say solo adventuring is something completely different to any of the other sort of adventures or trips I've been on. It's lonely, it's tough, it can get scary, but it's so worth it. And as well as all the practical planning and the rest of it, if anybody is listening to this thinking that that's the bit of their comfort zone they haven't stepped out of yet, and really they want to go and try an adventure on their own, I would absolutely love to have a chat about that and how to prepare and what to expect.